All right, hello everyone. Excited to be here. My name's Haley Katzmann. I'm the Vice President of Growth at HighSpot. I'm here to talk about the enablement imperative, and more specifically, I'm sure a lot of you have recently been in a scenario where you've sat in on a call with one of your customer-facing teams. Maybe it's sales, maybe it's services, maybe it's one of your partners, and you just went, oh, that's not what you're supposed to be saying, or you're not using the right content. And what I'm here to talk about today is a way to help you fix that. So really looking forward to that. So part of my role as Vice President of Growth at HighSpot is that I lead our own internal enablement and operations team, which is really cool. But another really great part of my role is that I actually get to meet with thousands of different companies, specifically their product marketing and enablement teams. I get to hear from them, learn from them, and also consult them a little bit. And something that has happened over the past 5 years that I've been able to go and meet with companies all over the world, different industries, everywhere from hypergrowth startup to big, large enterprise institutions, is that a lot of times these items that we're looking at here don't land. So the product marketing teams are focused on the content, the messaging, the positioning. That's what every single one of you in this room are maniacally focused on building and creating. But you guys have heard this age-old stat, it kind of gets overused, but it's 70% of the content that is created to be used by sales goes completely unused, right? Super frustrating. So why does that happen? Well, a lot of teams will be focusing on traditional enablement, on having a portal to access all of this information, webinars, different regions for different teams to make sure that it's getting used, sending out email blasts, maybe an enablement update or new product launch email update. Sound familiar to people? And maybe even the Ask the Experts, maybe one-on-one sessions. But again, with all of these things, unfortunately, what we see is that a lot of times the content and the messaging and the positioning still doesn't get used in the right way in those conversations. Another interesting stat, 84% represents the number of acquisitions that actually fail. When I heard that number, I was kind of like, whoa, that's a big number. And this kind of sparked a little bit of an interest a little while ago for me and some of the team at HighSpot when we were going and having conversations with these, thousands of different companies. And a lot of the strategies that companies were making where someone in a room, the leadership team thinking about that go-to-market strategy, they're sitting in a room thinking about what is our growth initiative or strategic initiative for the upcoming quarter. Maybe it's acquisition, maybe it's going after a new competitor, maybe it's doing a cross-sell of a new product, so on and so forth. But a lot of times what happens is the product gets built or acquired, the content gets built, the messaging and the positioning, but it doesn't really land. And so the question is why? Why doesn't it actually land? Super frustrating, right? And this is something that we really wanted to crack the nut on, and I'm excited to talk to you more about how we think that we've actually got a pretty good solution to this. So let's talk a little bit first about kind of the conventional wisdom and the things that you have to do really well to start to actually go and land that strategy, whether it's an acquisition or a cross-sell or a new product launch. What are the things that you have to do to actually go and land that? Well, first you have to have great content management. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this and what you have to do with it, but a little bit of a spoiler alert, it's only half of the things that you have to do. It's half of the problem, or half of the solution rather. So for content management, you have to do some things really well. You have to have findability, you have to have analytics, you have to have governance. And what's kind of interesting is if you think about all the content that you're creating, that content is not only the content that's being used to go to your buyers or through your partners, but it's also the way that you kind of are teaching your customer-facing teams on how they should talk about that product and how they should go and have conversations with customers. And so the findability of that is super important. And if you think about that 70% stat that I talked about earlier, there's a couple of different reasons why there's that 70%. Well, sometimes it's because of findability, because they actually just never found it because it was too hard to find it or they didn't care, right? It could be that they actually found the content, but they didn't think that it was relevant or it wasn't the right content for them to use in a specific scenario. Or it could actually be that they found the content, but then when they used it, it wasn't the right content to use for that specific scenario, right? Which is why analytics are super important, to be able to understand, okay, we've created all of this content. I mean, think about like a lot of the companies that we work with are creating tens of thousands of content. So if you created 10,000 pieces of content, 7,000 of those go completely unused, which is like, ugh, gut-wrenching, right? So why? What's happening? Analytics are super important to be able to identify that. Is it not being found? Is it not relevant? Or is it not engaging your buyer? And then governance on that, especially for companies that are creating a lot of content on a, daily, weekly, quarterly, annual basis. You need to make sure that it's fresh, it's up to date. None of the stories that I've heard where someone in product marketing goes and sits down next to a sales rep and they're using a deck from 6 years ago. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that, but you've got to govern the content and make sure that it's always being up to date. It's always the most fresh content being used. But like I said, this is really only half of the problem. And so if you think about why this hasn't historically worked, just having great content management, why that really doesn't provide the solution, if you pivot a little bit to think about what we're trying to accomplish here, it's really about elevating conversations to win and keep customers. And at first that can kind of sound like fluff. Well, obviously conversations are kind of important. And it's not everything that product marketing is focused on, but it's a large part of it, right? So if you think about product marketing, there are one-to-many conversations through campaigns, and then there's also one-to-one conversations. And product marketing has to go through the customer-facing teams, through sales, through services, through partner. It's super important. And all the ways that that's happening, it's through conversations. It could be an email, it could be a phone call, but it's one-to-one conversations. And so if you think about all that work, the time, the money, the investment that's put into creating all of those resources and the messaging and the positioning, if it doesn't land internally first, and then it doesn't land with your buyer through those teams, then a lot of that's going to waste, right? So it actually is, at the end of the day, about how that lands internally and how those conversations are going with your end customer. Now, if you think about customers today, right? Modern buyers, they are more and more educated than ever. I can't tell you how many times I've talked with product marketing teams and they've said, I just listened in on, a call recording or even sat in on one live, and the buyer actually knew more than the person on our team, more than the salesperson, more than the services person, because they're more informed than ever. There's review sites, there's references, they have a lot of information at their fingertips. And so customers have high expectations, and you have to win by exceeding those expectations. So, how do we actually land those customer conversations and exceed expectations of our customers? Well, content management, I'm not diminishing that at all. It's actually something that's critically important. We at HighSpot do that for a living. It's part of what we do for a living. It's super, super important, but it's not the only part. And over the past 5 years that I've been at HighSpot, I would say over the past year, we've really figured this out, that there's more than just content management. So what's the other part? The other part is guidance. You actually have to write down, whether it's on a piece of paper, whether it's PDF, wherever it is, you actually have to write down what that customer-facing person has to know in a situation, what they should be saying, and what they should be showing. All this content is created, but they don't necessarily know how to use it for all those different scenarios that they're in. And the crazy thing is when I go and talk to different teams, I ask, are you writing down what they should know, say, and show for all the different scenarios that they're in? Maybe it's, for a different region, and it's about, we just talked a lot about competitive intelligence. Are you talking about what the competitive talking points are for a specific region, for a specific market segment, for a specific industry? Maybe, maybe not. But if you're not, guess what? They're out there having conversations right now. Right now, they're out there having conversations and they're probably making it up. And that's why at the beginning of the conversation, when you go in and you sit in on those calls and go, well, that's not the messaging and positioning that we came up with. Well, it's oftentimes because sales, services, or even partners are thinking in terms of specific scenarios. They're thinking in terms of action, not necessarily in terms of content or campaigns. That's not how they think, right? So you have to actually go and write it down. So if you think about elevating that customer conversation, writing down what to know, what to say, what to show, what does that actually mean? So what to know? A lot of times that will be context, training, thought leadership. What do they actually need to know about that scenario? For what to say, what are the talking points? How do you handle objections? What are the landmine questions to ask? What should they actually be saying in those specific scenarios? And then what to show? All of the beautiful, amazing content that's been created, instead of just kind of throwing that over the wall, or even in a content management system, teaching them exactly which content to use in which scenario. Now, this is one of those things where, great, I've come up here and I've said, no, say, show. Okay, everyone go back and write that down. Well, it's something that's really easy to say when I'm standing up here on stage, but it's actually something that's kind of hard to do. The good news is that we can help with it and have a methodology and everything around it. But it is hard. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so something that I found really interesting. So in having a lot of these conversations, sometimes I do them more in kind of a consulting context, or sometimes it's more in, more of an informational kind of interview. And one of the things that we realized a little while back was that marketing and the customer-facing teams think in different ways. And a lot of times we'll talk about alignment, which is super important, but there's a couple things that there doesn't need to necessarily be alignment because they work in different ways. A good example would be marketing is actually incentivized to think about one-to-many, right? It would be bad to think about one-to-one, right? Sales, services, partners, they can't even wrap their mind around thinking about one-to-many. It's, I'm waking up in the morning, I have a call at 3 p.m. What am I supposed to say in that specific conversation, right? Another thing is the cadence. Marketing is thinking much further ahead than when sales is thinking about close of quarter, right? And that's okay, but we have to realize that and we have to acknowledge it. And something that's super interesting is that when you think about content and campaigns, they're oftentimes organized or delivered in ways that marketing thinks. But what guidance is really focused on is thinking about the end user internally in your organization, the audience. I'll kind of use that word, audience. And your internal audiences are thinking in terms of action. So if you think about personas, they're thinking about personas, right? They think about compete. They're thinking about a cross-sell motion or an upsell motion. They're thinking about what industry the customer is in that they're going and talking to, or maybe even a new product that they have to go and sell, maybe even event. If you even actually think about this event here, or think about an event that maybe anyone on your customer teams that they're going to, whether they're have a booth outside there or whether it's another event, do they know what to know, say, and show for that specific event, or just do they kind of have to piece it together with the knowledge that they've been given? So they're always thinking about action, and it's super important that guidance is framed in action rather than in content or campaigns. Not to say that those things aren't important, but it's actually the way that you can deliver those things. So what's a tangible example of guidance? One of the most effective ways, and now seeing this with many different companies that we work with, it's actually become the first tangible thing that can actually help drive the alignment between marketing and the customer-facing teams and really help land this, is through a play. And a play is something that is scenario-based or situationally based. It's targeted towards a specific internal audience. So maybe it's your account executives, maybe it's your partners, maybe it's your SDRs or your AMs or even your services team. And it outlines what to know, what to say, and what to show for that specific scenario. And you actually have it written down. And it pulls in the content, it pulls in the training, it pulls in the talking points for that specific scenario. And then what happens is you actually have a tangible item that you can deliver for that moment of action, rather than having the customer-facing teams have to take all of this information from different places and contextually pull it together in their own mind. Okay, so guidance, if you think about this, guidance will actually turn your content into action. So instead of just kind of building the content, throwing it over the wall, having it in a content management system, it will actually take that content and put it into action. And one of the funny things that actually happened, I'll even just say at our own company, we practice what we preach at HighSpot. was that when we started really becoming great at guidance, it's kind of unnatural at first. So I was talking with a couple of people on our marketing team and they were like, we want to run a content play. And I was like, no, you may not run a content play, because a salesperson does not wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to send a piece of content. That doesn't happen, right? They say, hey, I have a call with this persona, this industry, this market segment, or I'm going up against this competitor in a deal, right? Now, the initial reaction was like, well, that's not very helpful for our content. But it actually was, because what I said was that instead of that piece of content going into one play or being shared out once, we actually put the piece of content, there was a whole campaign around a piece of content that we were having this conversation around. We actually ended up putting that piece of content into 6 different plays. And it got used way, way, way more than it would have if we would have just rolled out a campaign or communication around that specific content. And then it was like, And so the way that our marketing team started to think was, okay, not just rolling out a piece of content, but what types of scenarios would this content be relevant in, and what types of plays can we put it in? So it kind of changed the way that we communicate with one another. And so as a result of that, what I've actually seen, not only at our company, but at a lot of the different companies that we work with, is that guidance actually ends up becoming this bridge between marketing and sales, or your customer-facing teams. It's almost a translator, because like I said, naturally the two functions think in a different way, which is okay. Let's not try and change that, but let's have a bridge or a translator between the two so that we can land the content, the messaging, and the positioning in every single conversation. And so when you think about guidance and the plays as being that translator, it's actually, it's a fantastic bridge between the two functions. And then if you think about what I'll talk about in a second around being able to really dig in and measure and analyze that, it becomes really, really insightful. Okay, so now the magic question. Okay, you've talked about guidance, you've talked about these awesome plays. Who's building these? Who's doing that, right? Well, let's talk about the different options. Can product marketing build the guidance? Well, absolutely experts on the content, the messaging, the positioning, on the topic. So let's just even say it was compete or it was an acquisition, right? Absolutely an expert on the topic. But are you intimately in every single type of conversation and know all the nitty-gritty details? Probably not. Okay, so then should sales and services be building the guidance? Well, I'll tell you right now that they're probably building it today, which is a little scary, right? They're probably doing that right now. They definitely know the scenarios intimately, but they're certainly not going to be experts on the messaging and positioning. I, at one time, was a sales leader, and trust me, at that time, you would have not wanted me building out the messaging and positioning around all those different scenarios. Then, of course, you have enablement. Now, enablement should be familiar with both of these areas, but they're not truly the topic subject matter expert, and they're not going to be, all the time in every single conversation. So what's interesting about this is that it's actually all 3 of these people. These 3 teams have to come together to build the guidance. Interesting, right? Because you might go, ugh, right? But if you think about it, if you don't pull these 3 people together to build the guidance, I can guarantee you that it is not landing internally. Therefore, it will not land with your customers. It's super important. I was actually 2 weeks ago, I was actually with one of our customers, and we were kind of going through a workshop on this, and we pulled in enablement, we pulled in product marketing, and I don't think that they'd ever pulled in a sales manager or even like a top performing sales rep to talk about what the no, say, show for a specific scenario. And I can't tell you how amazing the conversation was by having all 3 of these teams in the room. And at first, it was a little bit of bickering in the room. And then what happened is that because all 3 of these parties were in the room, the conversation wasn't emotional. It was very much rooted in the actual scenario, and it was, here's what I would actually use. Here's what I would actually say. Okay, interesting that you would say that. What if you tweaked it a little bit? The conversation became much more real, and it was so apparent that had we not had that conversation, who knows what every single person at the company was saying for that scenario. And it became so real that we had to continue doing this. So it's super important to get all of these three parties together to build out that guidance effectively. Okay, so if you think about that framework of what to know, what to say, what to show, something that's really interesting about it is that you can actually think about this in terms of analytics. So let's just take the acquisition scenario as an example. What most companies have to think about is if they understand if that acquisition is successful or not, basically have to wait until you either get the revenue or you don't get the revenue, right? Which there's oftentimes a lot of lag time there, which doesn't give you all in this room much time to iterate, to understand what's working and what's not working. Now, what if I told you that you would be able to understand if your customer-facing teams understood it, if they were saying the right things, and if it was landing with your buyers before you hit or miss that revenue number, giving you time to iterate on that, to course correct before you had a miss. That'd be pretty cool, right? And so having these plays and having this framework of know, say, show actually gives a fantastic framework for being able to measure the know, say, show so that you can iterate at a faster rate to better hit your goal, whatever it may be, whether it's revenue, whether it's customer satisfaction, whether it's pipeline, whatever it is. Now, the thing that's really important in being able to do this is that you obviously need modern analytics. And it becomes very special if you can measure the difference between these sections. So if you think about what to know, so that's usually going to be internal materials. We need to understand internally what the team's doing with it. Say, we want to be able to analyze what the customer conversations look like or the emails look like. Show, is that content being opened? Is the content being clicked on? Is it being engaged with? How long is it being engaged with? What's not being looked at so that you can go and iterate? What's super important on top of that, and really where you get the magic in place, if you want to go and say, what's product marketing's influence on revenue through the product, the content, the messaging, and positioning, you have to use AI. And let's talk about why. So one really good example of this would be, let's just think of a customer deck, a pitch deck that, I'm sure most of you in this room have created at one point in time. If you wanted to go and understand what was the influence revenue on that piece of content, usually the answer would actually be 0. Why? The answer would be 0 because we're also pushing this world where we want personalization, where we want it to be dialed in for that specific customer. And so usually that deck had some modification made to it. Maybe the agenda was changed, maybe a logo was added, maybe they took out a couple slides, maybe they added it, maybe they did something bad that they weren't supposed to do, often the times. But if that deck is changed, then you will not see the influence revenue on that without AI inferencing, what we call content genomics. And so with modern analytics, with AI inferencing, you can actually look at an original deck that was made, all of the variations or changes that were made to it, and then go back and attribute that amount of revenue back to that original deck. And that becomes where the magic happens. So we talked about content management and the importance of content management and how it's not the full equation. You can't just throw content over the wall. And even when you do have a great Amazon-like experience for findability, for analytics, and for governance, it's really about having guidance around that content. And that's what makes it truly successful. And as a result of that, you're going to be able to show business outcomes for what you're doing from a product marketing perspective. Increase win rates, renewal rates, deal velocity, buyer satisfaction, and actually be able to go back and look at where you are making an impact on these areas. So again, competitive differentiation. A clear goal of that might be to increase your competitive win rate. Well, instead of having to wait to see until the competitive win rate was increased or not, did you build the play? Did you land it? Did it land internally? Did it land externally? What worked? What didn't work? Let's iterate and understand what the influence revenue is on that. So it's a great way to have a tangible item that you can really align your product marketing team, yourselves, with all of your customer-facing teams to land that strategy, that go-to-market strategy, and put it into action through your customer-facing teams. So I will actually be talking a little bit more about this tomorrow at 11:30 in the enablement room for any of you that are interested. We also have a booth right out here, but I think we might have a little bit of time to answer some questions. Yeah?
There's actually a question already in Slido. First of all, thank you so much, Haley. A round of applause for Haley. Thanks. One of the questions is, who is doing content right? Which company rocks in content, and who is the benchmark in the market?
Good question. So the company that I was referencing that I just did a workshop with about 2 weeks ago, ServiceNow, company that's doing guidance. I'll actually say content plus guidance. They're doing content plus guidance really well. We've been doing a lot of work with them for them to land the no-say show for all of their different teams. I can think of, I could go on and on with the list, but the anecdote that I just gave earlier was from a company, ServiceNow. Yeah.
Cool. And another question here is, do you use different product claims for different audiences? I'm assuming yes.
Do you use, yes, absolutely. So what becomes really interesting is that, so we actually have this framework that we use, and you actually, when you're building out a play, you'll answer 6 foundational questions, and I'll go through those in tomorrow's sessions at 11:30. But part of the questions that you have to answer is, who is your internal audience? What's the why? So why are you even running this play? Who is the customer? When would they actually go and use it? So if you think about the internal audience and then the specific customer that they might use it with, if you end up changing any of those dimensions, then the different product claims or value propositions that you would use actually end up changing quite a bit. So example being, if your customer was for one industry versus another, your product claim might change, and actually the product that you might be selling might actually change quite a bit. So it absolutely does. But answering these 6 foundational questions that we have helps come up with what messaging and positioning you should actually put in the play to help build that.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much, Haley.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So we're going to move